What do we inherit and how? That is going to be the topic of this episode of Qi Life. So at the moment, I'm working with a group that are going through the Elemetal Alchemy Qigong program with Long White Cloud Qigong. And we've been focusing a lot in the first weeks of that program on Wuji Qigong practices. And it's an interesting process to go through because Wuji Qigong is all about resetting our energy back to its natural, its original state. And there's lots of different parts to this. It's letting go of tensions and postural habits that we might have, but also things that might be held with, patterns of how our organs function, patterns of how our emotions are, a whole lot of different things that we're sort of resetting back to their original state. And one of the things that can be quite interesting about this is as we reset to our original state, we actually find that sometimes there's things to clear from us that actually are from before we were born. Essentially things that we've inherited from our parents or grandparents or previous generations, but they're not our truly natural state. Even when we were born, we might be carrying patterns that aren't our true natural, our true Wuji state. And this is it's certainly an interesting thing to experience, and it's also an interesting thing to, understand the concept behind as well. That we can actually have a natural state that is at a deeper level than what we were born with. Often when we think about what we inherit from our parents and from previous generations, of course, in this modern age, we think about our genes. And of course, our genes, our genetic code is an important part of what makes us up and gives us our shape and some of our strengths, some of our weaknesses in life, for sure. But there's a lot more that we inherit as well. And this is starting to become better known, better understood in the Western world and modern science as well, broadly under the topic of epigenetics. So basically, genetics are our genetic code. Epigenetics are all of the things that influence how our genetic code is actually manifest. Because if you think about the genetic code as a set of blueprints, there's something I think that a lot of people don't understand about our genes, in that, yes, it's a set of blueprints, essentially how our body will be built, but it's a set of blueprints that has multiple options within it. And because there's so many genes, it's many different options of how that can all come together according to how those genes express. And it's all of the factors in our environment around us that determine how those come out. So our genetic code isn't... it's not like what's the best word? I don't know how to call it. In some cases, people might take it as, a final sentence, or, like a judgment, like that's how you're going to be because of your genes. It's really not. There's lots of ways that can shape the way our genes express. And certainly, most fundamentally, as we're growing up, when we're young, a lot of things influence it then. But even, when we're older, we can also influence how our genes express, and this can change things to do with our health and so on. But there's more to it even than this, in terms of what we inherit from previous generations. Because there's a lot of things that we might find passing down through different generations that are clearly not a matter of genes, and I guess depending on how you take the term epigenetics, not necessarily even epigenetic either. And from a Chinese perspective, of course, and a Qigong perspective, we have a simple way of describing this as simply energy. We're inheriting energy. And, from a Chinese, point of view, again, we inherit our original Qi, which comes down from our parents, and of course they inherit it from their parents as well. And this is held within our kidneys, and that then affects our bone marrow and so on. And so clearly this has a link, with that link to the bone marrow and stem cells and things like that. Yeah, it has a link to our genes. But we think about it in a more general terms, in terms of, energy, which includes many different things. Energy incorporates, everything we experience in life, both physical and a lot of less tangible things as well. Now, some of these we can see, more clearly in terms of aspects of how some of these things might be passed down. So, for example, while a baby is in the womb, inside of the mother, uh, all of the things that the mother eats is going to affect the development of that child. So that's quite a physical thing, but it's something that's not genetic, but that is being passed on from the parents. Similarly, the emotions of the mother that the mother has during that time of pregnancy will have an effect on that developing baby and leave an imprint, leave impressions within the body, within the energy system, within that baby as well. Not just the mother, of course, the father as well. The emotions of the father is going to affect the mother, affect the general environment that baby is developing within, and leave an imprint on that baby even before it's born. And going back further, there can be other things, and a lot of this is quite subtle, which is why it's useful to just think of it as energy that's passed down. But again, to take a sort of quite tangible example, once that child is born, they are surrounded by their parents, and they often, as part of that, will adapt certain postural habits because they're copying the people who are around them. And like, oh, so, my mother carries her shoulder like this. I mean, this is just a silly example. And so they think that's normal. And so they think, well, I'll do this too because I'm copying my mother, Or my father, I don't know. You can imagine has some other postural thing. Maybe he stands with his chest like this all the time. And so as that child grows up and learns to do things, he's copying his father, develops this pattern, which then affects the function of the nerves, of the organs, and then affects emotions and so on. And it really, really shapes them. More than this, those patterns, again, it's not just to the parents, and it's not even just, during that growing up phase while the child's developing, but they can be passed down from previous generations as well. Sometimes quite subtle things. Again, postures, that's quite a physically obvious one. But even things like attitudes, even things, and this gets real subtle, in a way, memories can be passed down as well. Because many aspects of our memory is not just cognitive, but it's held within our body. And so these patterns are copied and then copied again and passed down into the children. As an example of maybe some of this more subtle transmission or inheritance, you might have possibly at some point met a young child. And if you've known the young child and maybe also known the grandparent, and maybe the grandparent and the child haven't even seen each other, and yet the child may have mannerisms of the grandparent, which maybe even the parents don't have, but somehow that has been passed down. So it's really interesting just how much can be passed down, a lot of which is not purely genetic. And again, the easiest way for us to think about this, we can identify some parts, the genes, the epigenetics, the physical stuff in the environment, postures, emotions, we can identify all these things as part of how this is inherited. It's hard to actually necessarily identify all the, really concrete ways that it's inherited. But we recognize that things are being passed down. And so from a Chinese perspective, we just talk about energy being inherited and passed down. Within the Wuji Qigong practices, we have there's an opportunity within them. The intention of them is to be able to release any blocked, any stuck patterns within us. And so that includes the patterns that we've accumulated during the last day or the last week. We might have developed a few patterns, things a bit out of balance. We clear that away back to our neutral state. It includes things, going back to, a year ago or 2 years ago. Maybe some things happened in our life, or we had an injury or an illness, and like that developed a pattern within our body. And we clear that away back to our neutral state where our energy can flow most freely. But it can also go back further, which is, I guess, the topic of this video, where we can actually clear patterns that might be stuck within us, that are out of balance, that maybe we've inherited from our parents, from our grandparents. And this is really, really interesting because, of course, if we've just inherited these patterns, we don't necessarily know how they formed. We just know I've got this pattern. Or even more so, we may not even realize we have that pattern until it starts to shift. Because we've just known that as how things are within us our whole lives. It's just that's just how things are. And then it starts to shift. It's like, oh wow, things can be different inside my body, inside my energy, inside the way I perceive the world around you. Really interesting thing to experience. So, yeah, I thought it was an interesting thing to talk about. Certainly, we had some really interesting discussions inside the course. We have Q&A sessions regularly, talk about people's experience with the practices and, you know, what might be going on, and you know, to give people an understanding of it. And certainly the Wuji Qigong practices, again, you can work with them at different levels. At a more superficial level, it's just like clearing stresses, patterns, tensions, you know, just from the day or the week or the last month or something like that, to bring you back to a more neutral state. But it can also go much, much, much deeper. And it's, yeah, interesting practice to work with from that perspective. Anyway, hopefully this has been interesting for you. If you have enjoyed the vlog, please like, comment, subscribe, share, all those good things. And I look forward to seeing you on another one soon.